The Mercedes SUV crumpled against the utility pole with a sound like the world splitting open. Glass exploded outward in a crystalline shower. Metal shrieked as it folded in on itself, and then came the smell, acrid chemical wrong. Smoke poured from beneath the crumpled hood, thick and black, the kind that meant seconds, not minutes. James Mitchell froze mid-step, one hand still clutching the plastic bag containing the sandwich he wouldn't eat, the other automatically checking his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. The interview started in 15 minutes. Assistant manager at Premium Auto Parts, $58,000 a year, health insurance that actually covered dental. The kind of job that meant Emily could have her own room instead of sleeping on the pull-out couch. The kind that meant he could stop calculating whether to buy milk or bread when both ran out on the same day. 47 people walked past the wreckage in the 30 seconds he stood there. A businessman in a gray suit quickened his pace, phone pressed to his ear. 2 college students with backpacks crossed to the opposite sidewalk. A woman pushing a stroller actually paused, hand rising toward her phone, then seemed to think better of it and hurried on. Nobody wanted to be late. Nobody wanted to get involved. Nobody wanted to be the one who stopped. The scream cut through the morning air like breaking bone. A woman staggered from the driver's side, blood trickling from a cut above her eyebrow, designer heels catching on the broken asphalt. Her voice had the raw edge of someone who'd just realized that money and power meant nothing when physics took over. She clawed at the rear door handle, wrenched it once, twice, and the metal refused to give. The smoke thickened. Somewhere inside the crumpled frame, a child was crying. James's wedding suit was 15 years old. The shoulders pulled tight when he moved too quickly, the fabric shiny at the elbows from years of careful dry cleaning only when absolutely necessary. He'd worn it to marry Linda in a church basement with folding chairs and flowers his mother grew in her backyard. He'd worn it to her funeral 3 years ago, standing at a graveside with rain soaking through the cheap wool, while Emily clutched his hand and asked when Mommy would wake up. It was the only suit he owned. He'd spent an hour last night pressing it with an iron that cut out halfway through, leaving a small burn mark on the inside of the left sleeve where nobody would see. The interview was 14 minutes away now. The little boy's face appeared in the rear window, pressed against glass that spiderwebbed with cracks. His mouth open in a silent scream that became very loud when the window finally gave way. 8 years old, maybe 9. The same age as Emily. The same terror in his eyes that James had seen in hers when the hospice nurse gently explained that sometimes Mommy's medicine stops working and there's nothing more the doctors can do. Linda's voice, soft as it had been those last weeks, whispered through his memory with perfect clarity. "Promise me you'll take care of Emily. Promise me you won't let grief make you hard. Promise me you'll love again someday." The smoke billowed thicker. Someone in the growing crowd shouted something about calling 911. The woman at the car door screamed again, this time with the ragged desperation of someone watching time run out in real time. James dropped his sandwich. Lunch had cost $4.62. He'd calculated it carefully, the cheapest option that would keep him functional through the afternoon shift he was supposed to work after nailing the interview. The bag hit the sidewalk, and he was already moving, the wedding suit jacket flapping open as he ran his work boots loud against pavement that suddenly seemed endless. The heat hit him first when he reached the car. Not fire yet, but the promise of it. Metal and plastic cooking from the inside out. The rear door was jammed where the frame had buckled, the child's seat twisted at an angle that made his nurse's training scream warnings about spinal injuries and internal bleeding. The boy's seatbelt had locked in the crash, the mechanism jammed, and the smoke was filling the interior with alarming speed. James's hands moved before his mind fully caught up. The center punch on his keychain, a gift from his supervisor at AutoZone, the kind of small kindness that people extend when they know you're barely holding on, fit perfectly in his palm. The window gave way on the second strike, safety glass dissolving into 1,000 harmless pieces. His right hand plunged through, found the seatbelt release, and his years of pediatric ICU training kicked in with muscle memory that 4 years of changing oil filters hadn't erased. Check airway, check breathing, check circulation. The boy was conscious, terrified, but responsive, no obvious head trauma. The seatbelt mechanism had jammed in the crash, the plastic housing warped from impact. James felt, rather than saw, the woman hovering at his shoulder, her expensive perfume mixing with the smoke and gasoline in a combination that made his stomach turn. The jacket sleeve tore first. The sound was small, insignificant against the chaos, but James felt it like a physical blow. The fabric gave way on the passenger door frame, 15-year-old wool, separating at a seam his mother had reinforced twice. Then his hands found the hot metal of the door frame, the seatbelt buckle that had been baking in the sun before the crash, and pain lanced through his palms in bright white bursts that he catalogued and dismissed in the same instant. Second-degree burns, partial thickness, treat with cool water and elevation. The boy came free all at once. James hauled him through the window opening, cradling his head the way he'd been trained to handle cervical spine injuries, his body automatically curling around the child to shield him as they stumbled backward. The explosion wasn't large, no Hollywood fireball, just a sudden whump of pressure and heat as the fuel line finally caught. The force knocked them both down. James felt debris pepper his back, hot fragments burning through the suit jacket, through the shirt beneath, into skin. Third-degree burns on the shoulder, full thickness, will need debridement. The child was screaming now, which meant his lungs worked. James's hands moved over him with practiced efficiency, checking pupil dilation, palpating ribs for breaks, watching the rise and fall of his chest for signs of pneumothorax. Everything vital seemed intact. The screaming tapered into crying, huge, gulping sobs that spoke of terror rather than agony. "You're okay. You're okay. You're okay." James wasn't sure if he said it aloud. The words were a prayer, a mantra, the same thing he'd told Emily every night for months after Linda died, holding her while she cried herself to sleep. The same thing he'd whispered to Thomas Cooper in the ICU at St. Michael's, while the ventilator alarm shrieked its silent warning, and James ran for the nursing station to report the malfunction for the 4th time in 6 hours. Hands pulled at him. EMTs materialized from somewhere, professionals with equipment and protocols taking over with the smooth efficiency of people who did this every day. James let them, his own hands shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to ebb. He became aware of the crowd, dozens of people with phones out recording everything, posting everything, sharing everything with strangers who would watch his life explode and scroll onto the next disaster. The woman from the car stood before him, blood still dripping from her forehead, her silk blouse torn at the shoulder. Up close, she had the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. Sharp cheekbones, perfect skin despite the blood, and dirt eyes that probably intimidated boardrooms. Right now, those eyes were doing something James hadn't seen in a long time. They were seeing him. "You saved my baby." Her voice cracked on the last word. Her hands reached for his, then hesitated when she saw the burns, angry red patches already blistering across his palms. James pulled back automatically, the same instinct that made him refuse handouts from well-meaning church ladies after Linda's funeral, the same pride that had him working 60-hour weeks at minimum wage rather than apply for assistance Emily technically qualified for. "He's okay, that's what matters." The words came out rougher than he intended. The EMTs were loading the boy onto a gurney, now vital signs stable, already calling ahead to the hospital for precautionary observation. The woman followed them with her eyes, then turned back to James with an intensity that made him want to step backward. "What's your name? Let me repay you. Hospital bills, anything you need." "No need, ma'am. Glad I could help." The lie tasted like ash. His hands were burning in a way that meant he'd need treatment. Probably antibiotics, definitely bandages that cost money he'd just allocated to Emily's asthma inhaler refill. The interview was in 11 minutes, and he was standing in the street in a torn, burned suit that smelled like smoke and gasoline, with a crowd of strangers filming his humiliation. But the alternative was accepting charity from a woman who probably spent more on her shoes than he made in a month. And that was a line he wouldn't cross. James turned before she could argue, before the EMTs could insist on checking him out, before anyone could ask questions he didn't want to answer. The crowd parted for him automatically, people stepping back from the crazy man who'd run into a burning car in his Sunday best. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from the auto parts store manager. Running 10 minutes behind. Interview pushed to 10:30. Relief and despair hit simultaneously. 10 minutes might be enough. 10 minutes was nowhere close to enough. His hands were shaking too badly to tie his shoes, let alone shake hands and pretend he was the kind of reliable employee they wanted. The jacket was ruined beyond repair, the burns on his back making every movement feel like someone was grinding broken glass into his spine. James walked 3 blocks before he let himself stop ducking into an alley between a laundromat and a bodega that sold everything expired at half price. His phone showed 10:17. The interview location was still 7 blocks away. His hands had moved past pain into a distant numbness that he recognized as shock setting in. When he tried to grip the phone to pull up directions one more time, his fingers wouldn't quite close. The number for AutoZone was still in his recent calls. His supervisor answered on the second ring, background noise of an air compressor and someone arguing about a carburetor bleeding through. "Marcus, where are you? You were supposed to open. Emergency? Won't happen again. Everything okay?" The lie came easier this time. "Yeah, all good. Be there in an hour." The line went dead. James stared at his phone at the reflection of his own face in the darkened screen. Soot smudged his cheek. The collar of his shirt had a dark stain that was probably blood from where debris had caught him across the shoulder. His wedding suit, the last good thing he owned from his life before everything fell apart, hung on him in tatters. The bodega had a first aid section. $2.47 for generic burn cream and gauze wraps. He bought them with the last bills in his wallet, leaving him with $52 until Friday's paycheck. Emily's inhaler refill cost $43.50. That left $8.50 for food for 2 people for 4 days. The bathroom at the bodega was exactly as terrible as expected, but the water ran cold and semi-clean. James peeled the jacket off first, biting down on the inside of his cheek when the fabric pulled free from the burns on his shoulder. The shirt came next, revealing damage that made him close his eyes and catalog injuries with clinical detachment. Second-degree burns across both palms. Third-degree burn roughly 4 inches in diameter on left shoulder blade. Multiple lacerations from debris, superficial, no sutures required. Smoke inhalation minimal. Vital signs stable despite shock. The burn cream wasn't enough. It was never enough. But he spread it carefully anyway, wrapping his hands in gauze that immediately soaked through with a combination of ointment and fluid weeping from broken blisters. Getting the shirt back on required creativity and several long moments of just breathing through the pain. The jacket was hopeless. He folded it carefully anyway, the automatic gesture of someone who'd been taught not to waste anything, even trash. 10:43. The interview was gone. James pulled out his phone and typed a message to the manager who'd given him a chance. "Family emergency. Sincerely sorry for wasting your time." Then he deleted it without sending because even that felt like making excuses. The walk back to AutoZone took 30 minutes. His supervisor took one look at him and sent him home without argument, which meant the shift he'd counted on was gone too. $67 in his pocket that morning. 52 now. The math was simple and brutal. The apartment building was a 4-story walk-up in a neighborhood where people minded their own business because everyone had something to hide. James climbed the stairs slowly, each step pulling at the burns on his back, his hands throbbing in rhythm with his pulse. The door to 3B stood slightly ajar, which meant Mrs. Dorothy Clark had already let herself in to check on things. Dorothy had been Linda's best friend, the one who'd sat through every chemo session, who'd taken Emily to the park when Linda was too weak to get out of bed, who'd shown up at the apartment the day after the funeral with enough casseroles to fill the freezer and a firm statement that she'd be checking in every day whether James liked it or not. She was 72, widowed twice, and had opinions about everything delivered in a voice that brooked no argument. She was in the kitchen when James entered, putting away groceries he hadn't bought. Her eyes tracked over him in one sharp sweep that missed nothing. "Child, what did you do?" "Helped someone." James moved past her toward the bathroom where the real first aid kit lived, the one with supplies he'd stolen from St. Michael's in the weeks before they forced his resignation. Dorothy followed, watching him struggle with the gauze on his hands before batting his fingers away and taking over with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. Helped someone right out of a job interview, looks like. It was unavoidable. Dorothy made a sound that encompassed an entire sermon on poor decision-making and foolish pride. She rewrapped his hands with proper technique, examined the burns on his shoulder with a clinical eye that made James remember she'd been a nurse's aide before arthritis forced her retirement. "This needs a doctor. Can't afford a doctor. Can't afford to get an infection that lands you in the ER either." Dorothy's hands were gentle despite her sharp tone. When the wounds were properly dressed, she crossed her arms and fixed him with a look that had probably terrified her children into straight-A students. "Linda would have smacked you upside the head for this kind of stupid. Linda would have stopped too. Linda had health insurance. Linda wasn't raising a child alone on garage wages." Dorothy's expression softened fractionally. "She would have stopped anyway, and we both know it. Question is what? Now. Now I go pick up Emily from school and figure out how to make $8 last until Friday. The groceries I brought should help with that." "Dorothy, don't." She held up one arthritic hand. "That's what neighbors do. That's what community means. You're always so busy being too proud to accept help that you forget Linda never had that problem. Linda didn't have a choice. Neither do you, baby. Neither do you." Dorothy left shortly after closing the door with a gentleness that somehow made James feel worse than if she'd slammed it. The apartment settled into silence, broken only by the radiator's irregular clanking and the muffled argument bleeding through the walls from 3A. James sat on the edge of the pull-out couch where Emily slept, staring at his bandaged hands. The sketchbook was under her pillow where she kept it every night. Linda's sketchbook, the one she'd filled with drawings during chemo sessions when sitting still was the only option. Flowers, mostly. Birds. Emily's face in 100 different expressions. James flipped through pages he'd memorized, stopping at the self-portrait Linda had drawn 2 weeks before she died. She'd made herself beautiful even then when the cancer had hollowed out her cheeks and stolen her hair. The eyes in the drawing were the same ones that had looked at him in the hospital and made him promise 3 impossible things. Take care of Emily. Don't let grief make you hard. Promise me you'll love again someday. He'd kept the first promise through sheer stubbornness and Dorothy's intervention. The second was already slipping away a little more each day every time he had to choose between food and dignity. The third felt like a betrayal even to consider. James closed the sketchbook and tucked it back under the pillow. The clock showed 2:47. Emily's school let out at 3:15. The walk took 20 minutes if he moved slowly enough that his back didn't split open. He changed into clean work clothes, the AutoZone uniform that smelled like motor oil and defeat, and headed back out into the afternoon heat. The elementary school was a squat brick building surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better decades. James joined the cluster of parents and guardians waiting by the main entrance, keeping his bandaged hands in his pockets. Nobody looked at him twice. Half the adults here were wearing work uniforms from jobs that ended at 3 p.m. to accommodate pickup duty. The other half had the worn, thin look of people juggling multiple shifts and chronic exhaustion. Emily emerged in the second wave of students, her backpack almost as big as she was, her braids slightly askew from a day of being 8 years old. She spotted him, and her face lit up with the kind of uncomplicated joy that made every burned inch of skin worth it. "Daddy, hey, sweetheart." She crashed into him at full speed, wrapping her arms around his waist. James caught her with a grunt of pain he converted into a cough. Emily pulled back, her expression shifting from joy to concern with the alarming perception she'd inherited from Linda. "You smell like smoke. Are you okay? Just some trouble at work. Nothing to worry about. Your hands are wrapped up. Burn them a little. They'll be fine." Emily's eyes narrowed in a look that was pure Linda, the one that said she knew he was lying, but would let it slide for now. She took his hand anyway, careful to hold his wrist instead of his palm, and they started the walk home in comfortable silence. 2 blocks from the apartment, she spoke again. "Mrs. Dorothy brought groceries. I know. She said you did something brave today. Mrs. Dorothy talks too much. She said Mommy would be proud." James's throat closed. He swallowed hard, focusing on the cracked sidewalk, the weeds pushing through concrete, anything but the image of Linda in that hospital bed making him promise to be brave enough to keep living. They reached the apartment building, climbed the stairs, and Emily immediately dumped her backpack and pulled out a paper with a giant A+ in red marker across the top. Math test. Mrs. Reynolds said I got the highest score in the class. That's my girl. She studied the pride in his face for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. Can we have spaghetti for dinner? Spaghetti was cheap. Pasta jarred sauce from the dollar store, a meal that would stretch across 2 days if he was careful. Sure thing. Emily disappeared into the bathroom to wash her hands, and James stood in the kitchen calculating dollars and cents with the grim precision of someone who'd gotten very good at math out of necessity. The phone in his pocket buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe to accept. The voice on the other end was cultured professional, the kind that came from expensive schools and a lifetime of being listened to. Mr. Mitchell speaking. This is David Chen, head of security for Patricia Donovan. Ms. Donovan would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding this morning's incident. I'm not interested in Ms. Donovan is very insistent. She's prepared to compensate you for your time. The offer hung in the air like a trap. James's first instinct was to refuse to hang up and block the number and pretend this morning had never happened. But Emily's math test was stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like Linda's favorite flower, and the inhaler prescription slip was next to it, and his burned hands throbbed in time with the reality that pride was a luxury he couldn't quite afford. When and where tomorrow 10 a.m.? I can send a car. I'll meet her somewhere public. Chen rattled off an address James didn't recognize somewhere in the financial district where people wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent. The kind of place where someone like him would stick out like an open wound. I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Miss Donovan is looking forward to speaking with you. The line went dead. James stared at his phone at his reflection in the darkened screen and wondered what kind of price tag came attached to a billionaire's gratitude. Emily called from the other room asking if she could use Mommy's colored pencils to draw while dinner cooked, and James told her yes because Linda had made him promise to let their daughter create beauty even when the world felt ugly. The spaghetti boiled while Emily drew at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration the same way Linda's had. James watched her sketch what looked like a tree, adding careful details to the trunk. The branches, something carved into the bark that he couldn't quite make out from across the room. What are you drawing? The tree in the backyard. See? She held up the paper. The tiny backyard behind the building had exactly one tree, an old oak that had probably been there since before the neighborhood went to hell. Someone decades ago had carved initials into the trunk. LM plus JM equals forever. Linda and James. Their first apartment together before cancer, back when forever seemed like a promise the universe might actually keep. You made it really pretty, sweetheart. Emily studied her drawing with a critical eye. I want to add something. Maybe more initials. For other people who love each other. The spaghetti threatened to boil over. James turned down the heat, stirred the pasta, and tried to figure out how to explain to an 8-year-old that forever was just a word people used when they didn't know how to say, until death do us part. That's a nice idea. They ate dinner on the pull-out couch because the kitchen table was too small for 2 people and Emily's homework. The spaghetti tasted like every other meal they'd shared in 3 years of careful rationing and strategic shopping. Emily chattered about school, about the solar system project her class was starting, about how her friend Jessica's family was getting a dog, and could they maybe get one too someday. Maybe someday. The phrase came automatically, the same thing he'd been saying for 3 years about everything Emily wanted that cost money or required a stability they didn't have. Someday we'll have a bigger apartment. Someday you can take art classes like you want. Someday things will be better. Someday never seemed to arrive. After dinner, Emily did homework at the kitchen table while James washed dishes, one-handed his bandaged palms, making everything take 3 times as long. The burns were settling into a deep, persistent ache that over-the-counter painkillers barely touched. He'd need to change the dressings before bed, clean the wounds again. Hoped that Dorothy's dire warnings about infection were just her usual pessimism. Bedtime came at 8:30, the same routine they'd maintained since Linda died. Brush teeth, change into pajamas, pull out the couch into its bed configuration. Emily retrieved Linda's sketchbook from under her pillow, studying one of the flower drawings with intense concentration. "Do you think Mommy knows when we do good things?" James sat on the edge of the bed, his body screaming protest at the movement. "I think if anyone's watching over us, it's her. Mrs. Dorothy said you saved a little boy today." The story was already out there then, spreading through the neighborhood network of people who noticed everything and forgot nothing. James just helped someone who needed it, like Mommy used to help people. Yeah, like that. Emily closed the sketchbook, holding it against her chest. "I'm glad you helped, even if it hurt you. That's what being brave means, right? Doing the right thing even when it's hard." The question had layers. James wasn't equipped to unpack, not at 8:30 on a Tuesday, with burns throbbing across his back and $52 between his family and homelessness. He kissed the top of Emily's head instead, breathing in the scent of the cheap shampoo Dorothy had brought over the faint smell of crayons and childhood that was the only thing keeping him sane. "That's exactly what it means. Now get some sleep. Love you, Daddy. Love you more, sweetheart." James turned off the light, leaving the door cracked, so the hallway illuminated the room in a gentle glow Emily claimed helped keep the bad dreams away. He made it to the bathroom before the shaking started, adrenaline finally crashing in waves that left him gripping the sink with bandaged hands. The mirror showed someone he barely recognized. Soot still streaked his face despite washing. The burns on his shoulder had started seeping through the bandages, dark spots spreading across the white gauze. He looked like what he was, a man who'd run out of options and was starting to run out of hope. The medicine cabinet held the stolen medical supplies from St. Michael's, the things he'd taken in the 2 weeks between when they told him he was being investigated and when they forced his resignation. Sterile gauze, antibiotic ointment, irrigation solution that was probably expired, but still better than nothing. James unwrapped his hands with mechanical precision, cleaned the burns with a detachment he'd learned in nursing school, and dressed them fresh. The shoulder required more creativity. He couldn't reach it properly, couldn't see the full extent of damage, but he managed to get the old bandage off and fresh ointment spread across angry, weeping tissue. The new dressing went on crooked and loose, but it was better than infection. His phone buzzed on the counter. A reminder he'd set weeks ago when hope still felt possible. "Emily's inhaler refill due tomorrow. Call pharmacy, $43.50. He had 52. That left $8.50 for everything else. James deleted the reminder and set a new one. "Call Patricia Donovan's office, confirm meeting." Because pride was a luxury, and his daughter needed to breathe, and sometimes being brave meant accepting help from strangers who'd watched you burn your life to save theirs. The apartment settled into night sounds around him. Emily's soft breathing from the other room. The couple in 3A arguing about money in vicious whispers that carried through thin walls. Somewhere outside a car alarm went off and was silenced. The radiator clanked and hissed. James pulled out his phone one more time and pulled up the video he'd saved from Linda's last week. She was barely recognizable, cancer having stolen everything but her eyes and her voice. The recording was shaky, filmed on his phone in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and death. "Promise me you'll take care of Emily. I promise. Promise me you won't let grief make you hard. I promise. Promise me you'll love again someday. Not tomorrow, not next year, but someday. Promise me, James." The video ended. James had promised. He'd promised all three things because denying a dying woman was impossible, because Linda had been the only person who'd ever believed he was worth loving, because even then he'd known he was lying about the third promise. 3 years later, he was still lying, still going through the motions of survival without living, still too scared to open his heart, because the last time he did, cancer had ripped it out and left him bleeding. The meeting with Patricia Donovan was in 12 hours. James set an alarm, checked on Emily one more time, and lay down on the air mattress he'd set up in the corner of the living room. The burns made sleep impossible. He stared at the ceiling, counting water stains and calculating how many meals $8.50 could stretch into, and waited for morning to arrive with whatever new disaster it had planned. The office building was all glass and steel, the kind of architecture that screamed money so loudly it didn't need to say anything at all. James stood on the sidewalk outside, watching his reflection warp in the mirrored surface. The AutoZone uniform was the cleanest thing he owned that didn't have burns or tears. His hands were still wrapped in gauze, the white already graying from the subway ride downtown. Security stopped him at the lobby desk. A woman in a crisp uniform looked him up and down with the practiced disdain of someone paid to keep the wrong people out. "Delivery entrance is around back. I have a meeting. Patricia Donovan's office." The guard's expression shifted fractionally, doubt replacing certainty. She picked up a phone, murmured something James couldn't hear, then gestured toward the elevator bank with obvious reluctance. 47th floor. They're expecting you." The elevator had mirrors on 3 walls reflecting James from every angle. The uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds in 3 years of strategic meal skipping. The bandages on his hands looked worse under fluorescent lighting, stained with the yellow-brown of seepage that meant the burns weren't healing as cleanly as he'd hoped. He caught himself adjusting his posture, pulling his shoulders back, trying to look like someone who belonged in buildings like this. The elevator opened onto a reception area larger than his entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that probably cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. A receptionist with perfect makeup and a practiced smile gestured toward a seating area. "Mr. Mitchell, Miss Donovan will be with you shortly." Shortly turned into 15 minutes. James sat on furniture that probably cost more than his car, trying not to touch anything with his bandaged hands. The magazines on the coffee table were financial journals and industry publications, the kind of reading material that assumed everyone understood stock portfolios and market trends. A door opened. The woman who emerged matched her building expensive polished, designed to impress. Patricia Donovan wore a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made specifically for her body, her dark hair pulled back in a style that managed to look both severe and elegant. The cut above her eyebrow from yesterday's crash had been covered with makeup barely visible. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, probably practiced to convey confidence and control. James's bandaged hands made the gesture awkward. Patricia noticed her eyes tracking to the gauze, then back to his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Please come in." The office beyond was exactly what he'd expected. More glass, more views, furniture that cost more than college tuition. Photographs on the wall showed Patricia shaking hands with people James vaguely recognized from news coverage. Governors, senators, executives from companies that made headlines. A smaller frame on her desk held a picture of her and the boy from yesterday, both smiling, both clearly posed by a professional photographer. Patricia gestured to a chair across from her desk. James sat cataloging details with the automatic assessment he'd learned in nursing: the tension in her shoulders, the carefully controlled posture, the way her fingers drummed once against the desk before she folded her hands to stillness. "How are your injuries manageable? Have you seen a doctor?" "Can't afford a doctor?" The bluntness seemed to surprise her. Patricia's perfectly maintained expression cracked just slightly. Something that might have been guilt flickering across her features before control reasserted itself. "I can arrange. I didn't come here for medical care. Your security chief said you wanted to speak with me." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying him with an intensity that made James want to check if he'd forgotten to zip something or had food in his teeth. She was evaluating him, assessing value the way people with money always did. "You saved my son's life yesterday. Brian means everything to me. There's no amount of money that can repay that, but I'd like to try." "I don't want your money." "Everyone wants money, Mr. Mitchell. The question is whether they're honest enough to admit it." The statement hung between them, accusation wrapped in observation. James thought about the $52 in his wallet, about Emily's inhaler prescription, about the interview he'd missed and the shift he'd lost. Pride was already a luxury he couldn't afford. Lying about it seemed pointless. "You're right. I need money. Everyone needs money. But I don't take charity. This wouldn't be charity." Patricia pulled a folder from her desk drawer, opening it to reveal what looked like a background check. James's stomach dropped as he recognized his own life laid out in bureaucratic detail. Employment history at AutoZone. The gap before that, 4 years of nothing. His address in a neighborhood the report probably labeled high crime. Emily's school records, her mother's death certificate, even the hospital bills from Linda's final weeks. You investigated me. I wanted to understand who saved my son. Patricia's finger traced a line in the report. You were a pediatric ICU nurse at St. Michael's Hospital, one of the best according to records I was able to access. Then 4 years ago you resigned following an internal inquiry into a patient death. The details are sealed, but the hospital paid you a settlement on the condition you sign a non-disclosure agreement. James's hands clenched involuntarily, pain lancing through burned palms. The Thomas Cooper case, 7 years old, post-surgical ventilator support alarm system that had been flagged for malfunction 3 separate times before it finally failed during night shift. Thomas had been dead for 6 minutes before James discovered him. The monitors silent the ventilator showing normal function, despite delivering nothing. That's none of your business. It becomes my business when I want to hire you. The words landed like a physical blow. James stared at Patricia, trying to process what he'd just heard through the white noise suddenly filling his head. Hire me for what I'm a mechanic. You're a nurse. One who was forced out of a career by a hospital more interested in protecting itself than finding the truth. Patricia closed the folder. I run a pharmaceutical company, Mr. Mitchell. We develop drugs, we run clinical trials, we're supposed to help people. But lately I've been concerned that profit is taking priority over patients. What does that have to do with me? I have a board member who's pushing for approval of a cardiac medication called CardioZen. The trials look clean on paper, but something feels wrong. I need someone with medical expertise who isn't already part of my corporate structure. Someone who can review the data with fresh eyes. Someone I can trust. You don't know me. How could you trust me? Yesterday you ran into a burning car to save a stranger's child. You missed a job interview that could have changed your financial situation. You refused payment for your injuries. Patricia's expression softened fractionally. That tells me more about your character than any background check. I don't have an active nursing license. The NDA from St. Michael's included surrender of credentials. You don't need to practice nursing. You just need to read medical files and tell me if you see anything that concerns you. The job title would be Medical Safety Consultant. Salary is $85,000 a year. The number hit James like a second explosion. $85,000 was nearly double what he'd been making at AutoZone. It was health insurance and dental coverage. It was Emily's own bedroom and inhaler refills without counting pennies. It was every prayer he'd whispered over Linda's grave, asking for one break, just one chance to give their daughter the life she deserved. Why me? You could hire any number of qualified people. Because qualified people in my industry have conflicts of interest. They know which companies might hire them next, which executives they need to impress, which regulatory bodies they might work for someday. Patricia met his eyes directly. You have no stake in pharmaceutical politics. You were destroyed by institutional corruption. If there's something wrong with CardioZen, you won't look the other way to protect your career. The logic was sound. It was also a trap, the kind where someone offers you exactly what you need and pretends there's no price tag attached. James had seen enough of the world to know that rich people didn't hand out six-figure salaries without expecting something in return. What aren't you telling me? Patricia's smile was slight, acknowledging his perception. The board member pushing CardioZen is Dr. Richard Hayes. He was my father's best friend, someone I've trusted for years. If I'm wrong about my suspicions, I've damaged a relationship that matters to me. If I'm right and I can't prove it, he'll execute a hostile takeover of my company. Either way, I'm risking everything. So you want me to be your weapon. I want you to be my conscience. Patricia pulled a business card from her desk drawer, sliding it across polished wood. The decision is yours, Mr. Mitchell. But before you decide, think about what this could mean. Not just the money. The chance to use your skills again. The opportunity to prevent the kind of institutional failure that destroyed your career. The card was heavy stock embossed lettering, the kind of thing designed to impress. Patricia Donovan, CEO Donovan Pharmaceuticals. A phone number, an email address, the physical weight of possibility. James picked it up with bandaged fingers. I need time to think. Take 24 hours. Patricia stood extending her hand again. For what it's worth, Mr. Mitchell, I meant what I said. There's no amount of money that can repay saving Brian's life, but I'm hoping this might be a start." The handshake was briefer this time. James left the office, rode the elevator down through layers of wealth and power, and emerged onto the street where the real world smelled like exhaust and street vendor food. The business card was still in his hand, a rectangle of potential that weighed approximately nothing and everything simultaneously. The pharmacy was 3 blocks from his apartment, a chain store where the fluorescent lighting made everyone look sick. James joined the line at the prescription counter, mentally rehearsing the conversation about whether they'd accept partial payment now and the rest on Friday. The pharmacist was a tired-looking woman in her 50s, who'd probably heard every hard luck story in the book. She pulled up Emily's prescription without needing to hear the name. Albuterol inhaler, 90-day supply. That'll be $43.50. James pulled out his wallet, extracting the bills with careful precision. 2 20s of 531s, $52 total, which left $8.50 after the medication. The pharmacist counted it without comment, made change, and slid the white paper bag across the counter. The walk home took 20 minutes. James climbed the stairs to 3B, slowly, each step pulling at burns that had started weeping again despite fresh bandages that morning. Dorothy's door across the hall stood open, music from a gospel station drifting into the corridor. She appeared in her doorway before James could get his key in the lock. "Child, you look worse than yesterday." "Good to see you too, Dorothy. Don't sass me. Inside, both of you." Emily was already at Dorothy's kitchen table, homework spread in front of her, a glass of milk and homemade cookies within easy reach. She looked up when James entered, her expression cycling through relief and concern in the way that meant she'd been worrying. "Daddy, where were you?" "Had a meeting." "Everything's fine." Dorothy snorted a sound that conveyed eloquent skepticism. She gestured James toward a chair with the kind of command that made disobedience feel impossible. "Sit. You're about to fall over." The chair was older than Dorothy, worn comfortable by decades of use. James sat gratefully, his body reminding him that he'd barely slept and hadn't eaten since yesterday's half-portion of spaghetti. Dorothy was already moving, pulling leftover chicken and vegetables from her refrigerator with the efficiency of someone who'd been feeding people for 72 years. Emily returned to her math problems, tongue poking out in concentration. James watched her for a long moment, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her braids fell forward when she bent over the paper. Linda's face lived in their daughter, not just in features, but in expressions, in the fierce concentration she brought to everything she cared about. Dorothy set a plate in front of him, more food than he'd normally eat in 2 meals. The unspoken command was clear. James picked up the fork with clumsy bandaged hands and started eating. "You gonna tell me what happened, or am I supposed to guess?" "Met with the woman from yesterday, the one whose son I pulled out of the car. And she offered me a job." Dorothy's hands stilled in the middle of wrapping leftover chicken. Emily looked up from her homework, eyes wide. "What kind of job?" "Reviewing medical data for her pharmaceutical company. $85,000 a year." The number hung in the air like something physical. Dorothy recovered first, her expression shifting from surprise to calculation to something that might have been hope. "That's life-changing money." "I know. So what's the problem?" James set down his fork, appetite disappearing despite his body's desperate need for calories. "She wants me to investigate a board member she thinks is pushing a dangerous drug approval. If I find evidence, I'm helping her destroy someone's career. If I don't find anything, I've wasted her money and she's damaged relationships with her own board. Sounds like she trusts you to tell the truth either way." "She doesn't know me. She's making assumptions based on watching me do one decent thing. Baby." Dorothy sat down across from him, her arthritic hands folding on the table. "Linda made me promise something before she died. Made me swear I'd look after you and Emily, make sure you didn't disappear into grief and stubbornness. I'm managing fine. You're surviving. That's not the same as living." Dorothy's voice gentled. "Linda would have taken this job in a heartbeat. Not for the money, though Lord knows you need it. She'd have taken it because it's a chance to use your gifts again. I lost my license. I can't practice nursing. Reading medical files isn't practicing. It's what you were trained to do, using that beautiful brain Linda loved so much." Dorothy reached across and tapped his forehead gently. She didn't raise Emily to see her daddy waste his talents changing oil when he could be saving lives. The words hit harder than James wanted to admit. He looked at Emily, still bent over her homework, pretending not to listen while clearly catching every word. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Emily's pencil stilled. She studied him with Linda's eyes, seeing too much the way she always did. "Will it make you happy?" The question cut to the bone. James hadn't thought about happiness in 3 years, had categorized it with other luxuries he couldn't afford, like restaurant meals and vacations and hope for the future. "I don't know." "Then maybe you should try and find out." Emily returned to her math problem. "Mommy always said trying is how you know if something's worth doing." Dorothy made a sound of approval. "That child is wise beyond her years. She gets it from her mother, and her father, whether he admits it or not." Dorothy stood gathering dishes. 24 hours, she said. "That's plenty of time to overthink yourself into paralysis. Why don't you do something radical and trust that maybe, just maybe, the universe is trying to throw you a break?" The apartment felt emptier when they returned to it, Emily tired from homework and James exhausted from burns and decisions. Bedtime routine proceeded automatically. Teeth-brushed pajamas. The pull-out couch transformed into Emily's sleeping space. She retrieved Linda's sketchbook from under her pillow, flipping to a drawing of the oak tree in their tiny backyard. "I added more to my picture today. Want to see?" She held up her own drawing, the one she'd started yesterday. The oak tree was more detailed now, the initials LM plus JM equals forever, carved clearly in the trunk. But she'd added new letters below, careful and tentative. EM plus equals family. Who's the question mark for? Emily shrugged with studied casualness. Maybe someone new. Mrs. Dorothy says sometimes families grow in different ways. James sat on the edge of the bed, his chest tight with emotion he didn't have words for. "Your mom and I will always be your family, sweetheart." "I know. But Mommy's in heaven now. She can't really be here with us. She's with us. Every day. Every time you draw with her pencils or smile the way she used to." Emily considered this, her expression serious. "But what if there's room for someone else too? Like how you can love more than one person at the same time?" The theology was complicated for an 8-year-old. James suspected Dorothy's influence in the question, her gentle but persistent belief that grief didn't have to mean isolation. "There's always room for love, Emily. Your heart's big enough. So is yours, Daddy." She tucked herself under the covers before he could respond, hugging the sketchbook against her chest. James kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of cheap shampoo and childhood, and retreated to his air mattress in the living room. Sleep was impossible. His hands throbbed, his shoulder burned, and his mind kept cycling through the same calculations. $85,000 a year meant health insurance and dental coverage. It meant Emily's own room art supplies, maybe even the dog she'd been asking about. It meant stability for the first time since Linda's diagnosis. It also meant working for a woman he didn't know, investigating people he'd never met, potentially destroying careers based on data he'd analyze. It meant walking back into a medical world that had chewed him up and spit him out 4 years ago. The phone on the floor beside his mattress glowed with unread messages. One from AutoZone's manager asking if he'd be in for his shift tomorrow. One from an unknown number that was probably a bill collector. One from Dorothy with a single word: breathe. James pulled up the video of Linda again, the one he watched when insomnia and pain made sleep impossible. She was skeletal in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that clicked and hummed, buying time that couldn't be bought. Her eyes were still bright, though still seeing him when everyone else had stopped. "Promise me you won't let grief make you hard, James." The video version of himself responded with conviction he no longer felt. "I promise. The world will try to close you off. Don't let it. You've got so much love to give, so much good to do. Don't let losing me make you lose yourself." James watched until the battery warning appeared, then plugged in the phone and stared at the ceiling. Water stains formed patterns that looked like maps to places he'd never visit, constellations in peeling plaster. Morning arrived eventually. James gave up on sleep around 5, moving carefully to avoid waking Emily. The bathroom mirror showed damage that wasn't improving. burns that needed professional attention. He still couldn't afford dark circles under eyes that spoke of chronic exhaustion, the hollow cheeks of someone who'd been skipping too many meals for too long. The business card was still in his pocket, Patricia Donovan's contact information embossed in letters that caught the light. James pulled out his phone and typed a message before he could second-guess himself. "I accept your offer. When do I start?" The response came within minutes despite the early hour. "Monday 9 a.m. I'll have HR send over paperwork. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell." James deleted the message and sat on the edge of the bathtub, letting the enormity of the decision settle over him. He'd just agreed to walk back into a world he'd sworn never to touch again, working for a woman whose motivations he didn't fully understand, investigating something that could implode his life as thoroughly as St. Michael's had. The alternative was another 3 years of AutoZone, of counting pennies and skipping meals, of watching Emily grow up in an apartment where she slept on a pull-out couch because Daddy couldn't afford better. Emily emerged around 6:30, still in pajamas, her braids matted from sleep. She found James in the kitchen attempting to make breakfast one-handed while his bandaged palms refused to cooperate with basic tasks. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." Emily studied him with that too-old perception. "You decided about the job. How'd you know you have your thinking face on?" "The same one you get when you're trying to figure out if we can afford something." James managed to pour cereal into a bowl without spilling more than a few pieces. "I took the job." Emily's face lit with uncomplicated joy, the kind of reaction that made every burned inch of skin and every sleepless night worth enduring. "That's good, Daddy. That's really good." "We'll see. Mrs. Dorothy says trying is how you know." Emily accepted the bowl of cereal, picking out the marshmallows first the way Linda always had. "So even if it's scary, at least you're trying." The wisdom of 8-year-olds delivered between bites of cereal felt like judgment and absolution simultaneously. James sat across from his daughter, watching her eat, memorizing the moment, because grief had taught him that ordinary mornings could become precious memories without warning. The weekend passed in a haze of preparation and dread. Dorothy brought over clothes her late husband had worn, dress shirts and slacks that were slightly too large but infinitely better than AutoZone uniforms. James spent Saturday night online researching pharmaceutical approval processes and cardiac medications, trying to remember terminology he'd deliberately forgotten. Sunday, Dorothy insisted they attend church. James normally avoided it, uncomfortable with the pitying looks and the well-meaning questions about how he was managing. But Dorothy's church had been Linda's church, the place where they'd been married, where they'd held the funeral. Walking through those doors felt like confronting every promise he'd made and broken. The pastor was a woman in her 60s who'd visited Linda in the hospital, who'd sat with James while he sobbed in the church basement after the funeral. She found him after the service, her expression gentle. "I heard about your new job. Dorothy told me." "Of course she did. She's proud of you." "We all are." The pastor touched his arm briefly. "Linda would be too." "I'm not sure about that." "Why not?" "Because I'm doing this for money. For survival. Not because I'm trying to be a good person." The pastor's smile was sad and understanding. "James, sometimes survival is the most moral choice we can make. Keeping yourself and Emily alive and together, that's holy work." The words stayed with James through Sunday afternoon, through Monday morning preparations, through the subway ride downtown to an office building where he didn't belong. He arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a dead man's clothes that almost fit his hands, still bandaged, but the burns finally starting to heal. Patricia's assistant met him in the lobby, a young man with an efficiency that suggested expensive education and careful grooming. "Mr. Mitchell, follow me, please." The medical safety consultant office was on the 32nd floor, smaller than Patricia's, but still larger than his entire apartment. Windows offered a view of the city, a desk held computer equipment that looked brand new, and file boxes were stacked in one corner with labels James couldn't read from the doorway. Patricia appeared within minutes, dressed in another suit that probably cost thousands. She extended her hand, the gesture more businesslike than their last meeting. "Welcome to Donovan Pharmaceuticals. I've had my team pull all the CardioZen trial files. Everything you need should be here." James shook her hand carefully, aware of the bandages. Where should I start the clinical trial data? Phase 3 results specifically. Patricia moved to the file boxes, pulling out the first one. If there's something wrong with CardioZen, it'll be buried in the numbers. Patient outcomes, adverse events, anything that looks statistically improbable. What am I looking for specifically? I don't know. That's why I hired you. Patricia's expression was unreadable. Dr. Hayes is pushing for FDA approval within 3 weeks. If we're going to stop this, we need evidence before then. And if I don't find anything, then I'm wrong and I've damaged my relationship with someone who's been like family. Patricia met his eyes directly. But I'd rather be wrong than complicit in harming people. She left him alone with the files. James stood in the office for a long moment, looking at the boxes, the computer, the view of a city he'd never felt part of. Then he pulled the first file from the first box and started reading. The medical terminology came back faster than expected, muscle memory of a different kind. Patient demographics, dosing protocols, adverse event reports. CardioZen was designed to prevent atrial fibrillation in high-risk cardiac patients. The Phase 3 trial had enrolled 300 patients across 12 sites. James read for 2 hours straight, barely aware of time passing. The data was clean on the surface, efficacy rates within expected parameters. Side effects, manageable dropout rates, normal for cardiac trials. But something nagged at him, a pattern he couldn't quite articulate. He pulled up the individual patient files, cross-referencing adverse events against demographics. Most patients had experienced standard side effects, mild nausea, fatigue, occasional dizziness. But 3 patients had died during the trial, all ruled as unrelated to the medication. Michael Brown, 42, African-American, cause of death, listed as ventricular fibrillation from pre-existing condition. Laura Martinez, 38. Hispanic, cause of death, listed as acute cardiac arrest from pre-existing condition. Robert Johnson, 67. African-American, cause of death, listed as sudden cardiac death from pre-existing condition. James stared at the files, his nursing training screaming warnings. 3 cardiac deaths in a 300-person trial wasn't unusual by itself, but something about the pattern felt wrong. He pulled up the medication lists for each deceased patient, cross-referencing their prescriptions. All 3 had been on common blood pressure medications. James spent another hour researching drug interactions, pulling up pharmaceutical databases he'd once known by heart. CardioZen's mechanism of action involved potassium channel modulation. Combined with certain beta blockers, the interaction could theoretically cause... His office door opened. Patricia stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Find anything? James gestured to his computer screen where 3 death certificates were displayed. These patients all died of cardiac events during the trial, all ruled unrelated to CardioZen. That's not uncommon in cardiac trials. All 3 were taking beta blockers that could interact with CardioZen's mechanism of action. James pulled up the pharmaceutical database. The combination could cause fatal arrhythmias. Could or does, I'd need to see the actual autopsy reports to be certain, but the pattern is concerning enough to warrant investigation. Patricia's expression shifted, something that might have been vindication or grief flickering across her features. Dr. Hayes signed off on all 3 deaths as unrelated. He's the chief medical reviewer, which means if he knew about the interaction, he buried it. The accusation hung between them, heavy with implication. Patricia closed the door and moved to James's desk, studying the files with intense focus. Can you prove it? Not yet. But if I can access the autopsy reports and the detailed medication logs, I might be able to build a case. I'll get you whatever you need. Patricia's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. If Richard buried evidence of fatal interactions, I want to know everything. James watched her leave, returning his attention to the files with a growing sense of dread. He'd been working for 4 hours and had already found evidence of potential criminal negligence. Either Patricia's instincts were phenomenal, or Hayes had been breathtakingly careless in covering his tracks. The afternoon passed in a blur of medical records and pharmaceutical databases. James barely noticed when his office door opened again, this time revealing a woman in a white coat with graying hair and an expression of professional curiosity. "You must be Mitchell. I'm Dr. Margaret Foster, Chief Medical Officer." Her handshake was firm, assessing. James recognized the evaluation in her eyes, the way medical professionals sized up whether someone knew what they were doing. "Patricia says you were pediatric ICU at St. Michael's," was being the operative word. Margaret's expression softened fractionally. "I heard about what happened. For what it's worth, ventilator alarms fail more often than hospitals admit. Not often enough to make the news when they kill children." "No, not that often." Margaret glanced at the files spread across his desk. "Find anything interesting in the CardioZen data?" 3 deaths that might not be as unrelated as reported. Richard signed off on those deaths personally. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. "He's been with this company since Patricia's father founded it. Questioning his judgment is complicated. Questioning it is my job." "Yes, I suppose it is." Margaret moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. "Be careful, Mr. Mitchell. Richard Hayes is powerful, connected, and doesn't take kindly to threats against his authority. Is that a warning? It's advice from someone who's worked here longer than you've been alive." Margaret's smile was slight and sad. "But I'm glad Patricia hired you. Someone needs to ask the hard questions." She left James alone with files that were starting to paint a picture he didn't want to see. 3 deaths, all minority patients, all taking medications that should have raised red flags during trial design. The pattern suggested either spectacular incompetence or deliberate negligence. James's phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Mrs. Dorothy is making chicken tonight. She says you should eat before you come home." The message included a photo Emily at Dorothy's kitchen table holding up a drawing of what looked like a family. 2 adults, 1 child, all holding hands under a tree with initials carved in the trunk. James stared at the drawing for a long moment, then returned to the files. Somewhere in these pages was evidence that could save lives or destroy them. The weight of that responsibility felt like burns that never healed pain that medication couldn't touch. But for the first time in 4 years, James was using his training for something that mattered. For the first time since St. Michael's, he felt like a nurse again instead of someone pretending to be something he wasn't. The files waited. James pulled the next box closer and kept reading. The autopsy reports arrived on James's desk 3 days later, sealed in manila envelopes marked with the kind of confidential stamps that made secretaries look away when they delivered them. Patricia must have called in significant favors to obtain medical examiner records from 3 different jurisdictions. James opened the first envelope with hands that had finally healed enough to function without bandages. Michael Brown's autopsy was thorough, clinical, devastating. 42 years old, previously healthy except for managed hypertension. Cause of death, ventricular fibrillation leading to cardiac arrest. The toxicology panel showed therapeutic levels of metoprolol, a common beta blocker. CardioZen levels were within trial parameters. The medical examiner had concluded death resulted from underlying cardiac disease exacerbated by stress. James pulled up the pharmaceutical interaction database and ran the combination again. Metoprolol plus CardioZen, both affecting cardiac ion channels, both modulating the same electrical pathways. The theoretical risk was clear potentiation of effects leading to fatal arrhythmia. But theory wasn't proof, and one case wasn't a pattern. Laura Martinez's file told a similar story. 38, single mother, according to the demographic notes, cause of death, acute cardiac arrest. She'd been taking lisinopril and metoprolol, both standard treatments. Her autopsy showed a heart that should have kept beating for decades, stopped by an electrical cascade that looked exactly like what CardioZen interactions could cause. Robert Johnson, 67, veteran. The file noted military service, honorable discharge, Purple Heart recipient. His autopsy was more complex, decades of wear on a cardiovascular system stressed by combat and age. But the mechanism of death was identical. Sudden catastrophic arrhythmia. Beta blockers in his system. CardioZen at therapeutic levels. 3 deaths. 3 victims who'd trusted doctors and pharmaceutical companies in clinical trials. 3 families who'd been told the medication wasn't at fault. James spent the next week building his case with the obsessive focus he'd once brought to ICU rotations. He cross-referenced every medication, every dosage, every timeline. The pattern became undeniable. CardioZen caused fatal interactions with beta blockers, medications prescribed to 60% of cardiac patients. The trial should never have enrolled patients taking those drugs. The deaths should have triggered immediate investigation. Dr. Richard Hayes had signed off on every safety report. His initials were on documents declaring the deaths unrelated. His signature was on the application requesting expedited FDA approval. Patricia reviewed James's findings in her office, her expression growing harder with each page. When she finished reading, she was silent for a long moment, staring at the skyline beyond her windows. "You're certain about this?" "As certain as I can be without conducting the trials myself." James had prepared for skepticism, for doubt, for the possibility she'd hired him to confirm suspicions rather than investigate honestly. "But I can't prove intent. Only that the interaction exists and should have been caught. Richard has been pushing this drug for 2 years. Millions invested in development, FDA approval 3 weeks away." Patricia's hands were steady on the report, but her voice carried the weight of betrayal. "If we go public with this, I'm accusing my father's best friend of negligence that killed people. If you don't go public, CardioZen gets approved and kills more people." The stark choice hung between them. Patricia stood moving to the windows, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "I need to confront him first, give him a chance to explain. He'll deny everything, destroy evidence if he hasn't already. Then we'll have nothing except suspicions and a ruined relationship." Patricia turned back to James. "I won't make this accusation without giving him the opportunity to respond." The decision was already made, written in the set of her shoulders. James gathered his files, understanding that rich people had different rules about destroying each other, that friendships and family connections mattered more than evidence when money was involved. The confrontation happened 2 days later, though James only learned about it after the fact. Patricia called him to her office at 7 in the evening, long after most of the building had emptied. Her expression was carved from stone fury and grief warring for dominance. "I showed Richard your findings. Everything, the autopsy reports, the interaction data, the statistical analysis. How did he respond?" "He called it circumstantial, said the deaths were tragic but unrelated to CardioZen." Patricia's voice was flat, emotionless in the way that meant she was barely holding control. "Then he reminded me that he owns 18% of company shares and has the board votes to replace me as CEO. He threatened you. He gave me a choice. Drop the investigation or he executes a hostile takeover before the FDA approval hearing." Patricia moved to her desk, pulling out a folder that looked official and dense with legal language. "He's already started. Filed paperwork this morning claiming I'm mismanaging the company, making accusations against board members without evidence." "Can he do that?" "With the right board support, yes. And Richard has been cultivating those relationships for decades." Patricia's laugh was bitter. "I've been CEO for 8 years. He's been here since my father founded the company. So what now? Now I need more than medical analysis. I need proof that will convince the FDA, the board, and the public that CardioZen is dangerous." Patricia met his eyes directly. "Can you find it?" The weight of the question felt like carrying a child from a burning car, like making promises to a dying wife, like every moment when the right choice was also the impossible one. James thought about Michael Brown's 3 children, about Laura Martinez raising a daughter alone, about Robert Johnson surviving Vietnam only to die from corporate greed. "I'll try." The following week passed in a blur of deeper research. James contacted the families of the deceased trial participants, something that required Patricia's lawyers to navigate privacy regulations and ethical boundaries. Angela Brown answered her phone on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the permanent exhaustion of a widow raising 3 kids alone. "Mrs. Brown, my name is James Mitchell. I'm calling about your husband's participation in the CardioZen trial." The silence that followed was heavy with barely controlled emotion. "Michael died 8 months ago. The drug company said it wasn't the medication. I have reason to believe they were wrong." Another silence, longer this time. Angela's breathing was audible, quick and shallow, like someone trying not to cry. "They told me it was his heart, that he had underlying problems the doctors never caught. He didn't." James kept his voice gentle, the same tone he'd used with families in the ICU when delivering news that would change their lives. Your husband died because CardioZen interacted with his blood pressure medication. The pharmaceutical company knew the risk existed and enrolled him anyway. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know the truth, and because I'm trying to stop the FDA from approving a drug that could kill thousands of people. Angela was crying now, quiet sobs that spoke of grief too large for public expression. What do you need from me? Your permission to include Michael's case in a formal complaint to the FDA, and if you're willing, your testimony about what the company told you. She agreed within minutes, her voice strengthening as anger replaced sorrow. Carlos Martinez, Laura's widower, responded similarly, grief transforming into fury when James explained how his wife had died. Sarah Johnson, Robert's daughter, was a lawyer who understood immediately the implications of what James was describing. By Friday, James had 3 families willing to testify, medical evidence of fatal drug interactions, and a growing sense that he'd stepped into something far larger than reviewing clinical trial data. Patricia was fighting a war on multiple fronts: the FDA approval process, the hostile takeover attempt, and now the moral question of whether destroying Dr. Hayes meant destroying her company. Emily noticed the change in James, the way he stayed up late reviewing files, the tension that made his shoulders tight even when he was trying to relax. She found him at the kitchen table one night at midnight, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. "You're doing the jaw thing again." James looked up, guilt flooding through him at being caught working when he should have been sleeping. "What jaw thing? The one where you clench your teeth when you're scared but trying not to show it." Emily climbed into the chair across from him, wearing her pajamas with the faded stars. "Mommy used to notice it too." "I'm not scared. Just focused." "Liar." The word was delivered without accusation, simple observation from someone who knew him too well. "You're scared the same way you were when Mommy was sick, like something bad is going to happen and you can't stop it." The perception was devastating in its accuracy. James set down the file he'd been reading, giving Emily his full attention. "Something bad already happened. Now I'm trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Is that why the fancy lady keeps calling Patricia calls? Because we're working together on something important." Emily studied him with Linda's eyes, seeing through every deflection. "Do you like her?" The question blindsided James completely. "I barely know her." "But do you like her? The way grown-ups like each other?" James felt heat creep up his neck. "She's my boss, Emily. That's not what I asked." Emily's expression was serious, older than 8 years had any right to be. "Mrs. Dorothy says sometimes God sends people into our lives when we need them. Maybe the fancy lady is one of those people. Her name is Patricia, and she hired me to do a job, nothing more." "If you say so." Emily slid off the chair, padding toward the pull-out couch. "But Mommy told me something before she went to heaven. She said someday you'd meet someone who makes you want to smile again. She said when that happens, I should be happy for you." The words hit like a physical blow. James sat frozen as Emily climbed into bed, pulling Linda's sketchbook out from under her pillow and settling in to read it like a storybook. "Good night, Daddy." "Good night, sweetheart." James returned to his files, but the words kept echoing. "Someone who makes you want to smile again." He thought about Patricia in her glass office, fighting to save her company while trying to prevent a dangerous drug from reaching market. Thought about the way she'd listened when he explained the medical evidence, trusting his expertise without question. Thought about how she'd obtained autopsy reports within days, moved heaven and earth to give him the resources he needed. The attraction was there, undeniable and terrifying. Patricia was beautiful, intelligent, powerful enough to reshape reality when she decided something mattered. She was also so far out of his league that the gap felt unbridgeable, a billionaire CEO and a mechanic playing dress-up in a dead man's clothes. More importantly, admitting attraction felt like betraying Linda, like the promises he'd made at her bedside meant nothing if he could look at another woman and feel his heart stutter the way it hadn't in 3 years. The following Monday brought news that changed everything. Patricia called an emergency meeting, her expression grim when James arrived at her office. Dr. Margaret Foster was already there, along with Patricia's head legal counsel. Richard filed formal complaints with the board this morning. Patricia's voice was controlled, but fury simmered beneath. He's accusing me of harassment, claiming I'm manufacturing evidence to damage his reputation because I want to consolidate power. The legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine, spread documents across the conference table. He's also threatening to sue personally for defamation if you continue investigating CardioZen, claims the drug is safe and your analysis is based on flawed methodology. My methodology is peer-reviewed pharmaceutical science. He's hired experts who will say otherwise. Catherine's expression was sympathetic but realistic. And he's got the board votes to force a CEO replacement vote within 30 days. Patricia's hands clenched on the table. So I have a month to prove CardioZen is dangerous or lose my company. We could withdraw the FDA approval application. Margaret's suggestion was quiet, almost apologetic. Take CardioZen back for additional trials. Address the interaction concerns without making accusations. That gives Richard exactly what he wants. Patricia's voice was steel. He profits from the development costs already incurred, executes his takeover, and then fast-tracks approval under new management. People still die, he just doesn't face consequences. The alternative is going to war with a man who's been preparing for this longer than you've been CEO. Catherine gathered her documents. He spent years building alliances, cultivating board relationships. You're fighting with one hand tied behind your back. Then we untie the hand. Patricia looked at James. The FDA approval hearing is in 2 weeks. If we present evidence of fatal drug interactions with credible witness testimony, they'll deny approval regardless of what Richard claims. He'll argue the families are being manipulated by a disgraced nurse with an axe to grind against pharmaceutical companies. Catherine's assessment was brutal but accurate. Your expert witness lost his medical license under suspicious circumstances. That's what Richard's lawyers will focus on. I didn't lose my license. James kept his voice level despite the anger rising. I surrendered it under duress as part of an NDA with a hospital that wanted to bury their own negligence. Can you prove that? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. The NDA specifically prohibited James from discussing the circumstances of his resignation. Breaking it would expose him to lawsuits he couldn't afford, destroy any credibility he had, and validate everything Richard Hayes would claim about his motives. No, I can't prove it. Then we need another approach. Patricia stood moving to the windows in the gesture James had come to recognize as her thinking position. If Richard wants to make this about credibility, we make it about evidence. Medical evidence so overwhelming that my motives don't matter. The family's willing to testify is a start. Margaret pulled out her own files. But 3 deaths in a 300-person trial isn't statistically significant enough to halt approval by itself. We need more. What about the trial sites? James had been reviewing enrollment data for days. CardioZen was tested at 12 locations across 8 states. If the interaction is real, there should be other adverse events that were classified as unrelated. Accessing those records would require cooperation from each trial site. Catherine's expression suggested she was already calculating the legal obstacles. Most will refuse without a subpoena, and getting subpoenas requires evidence we don't have yet. Then we find the evidence another way. Patricia turned back to the group, her expression hardening into something James recognized from the car crash, a woman who'd decided to act regardless of consequences. We go directly to the FDA with what we have. Force a preliminary review before the approval hearing. Put Richard in a position where he has to defend his data publicly. That's a nuclear option. Catherine's objection was immediate. If the FDA sides with Richard, you lose all credibility. The board will remove you for cause, claiming you made reckless accusations that damaged the company. And if they side with us, we save lives. Patricia's voice allowed no argument. I'd rather lose my company than be complicit in killing people for profit. The meeting dissolved into logistics. Filing procedures, evidence compilation, witness preparation. James left with a list of tasks that would consume every waking hour for the next 2 weeks. The weight of it pressed down like burns that never fully healed. Emily was at Dorothy's when James got home that evening, giving him space to work without worrying about being present for dinner. He was halfway through drafting his formal analysis for the FDA when his phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the screen. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. The apology caught James off guard. You hired me to investigate. I'm investigating. I hired you expecting to find nothing, or at most some minor safety concerns that could be addressed through labeling changes. Patricia's voice carried exhaustion that matched his own. I didn't expect to uncover evidence that my father's best friend has been burying bodies for 2 years. What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry for doing my job? No. I want you to know that if this destroys your life the way St. Michael's did, I'll make it right. Whatever Richard's lawyers throw at you, whatever the board does, I'll protect you. You can't make that promise. James stared at his reflection in the darkened computer screen. You might not even be CEO in 30 days. Then I'll protect you anyway. The conviction in her voice was absolute. You saved my son's life. You've dedicated the last 3 weeks to preventing a tragedy. That matters more than corporate politics or Richard's threats. The moment stretched between them heavy with things neither of them was saying. James thought about Emily's question about whether he liked Patricia the way grown-ups liked each other. Thought about how wrong the timing was, how impossible the circumstances, how thoroughly grief and fear had taught him not to trust anything that felt like hope. I need to finish this analysis. Of course, I'll let you work. Patricia paused before hanging up, and her next words came quieter. Thank you, James, for everything. The line went dead. James sat in the silence of his apartment, surrounded by evidence of corporate negligence and his own complicated feelings, and wondered when exactly Patricia had started calling him by his first name. The next 10 days were a controlled catastrophe. James finished his formal analysis, 50 pages of medical evidence documenting how CardioZen caused fatal arrhythmias when combined with common cardiac medications. Angela Brown, Carlos Martinez, and Sarah Johnson provided sworn statements about their loved ones' deaths and what Donovan Pharmaceuticals had told them. Patricia's lawyers filed an emergency petition with the FDA requesting a preliminary safety review before the scheduled approval hearing. Dr. Richard Hayes responded by accelerating his hostile takeover attempt. Board members started receiving packets of information, carefully curated details about James's resignation from St. Michael's, questions about Patricia's judgment in hiring a disgraced nurse, suggestions that she was manufacturing a crisis to consolidate power. The corporate warfare was brutal and public, making headlines in pharmaceutical industry publications. James's apartment was broken into on a Tuesday night. Emily was at Dorothy's, thank God, leaving James alone when he came home to find the door forced open, files scattered across every surface, his laptop missing. The police took a report with the board efficiency of people who saw break-ins every day in neighborhoods like this. Nothing valuable taken except the computer. The officer's assessment was delivered without irony. James didn't bother explaining that the laptop contained backup copies of his CardioZen analysis, that the break-in was too targeted to be random, that someone had just tried to destroy evidence he'd already submitted to the FDA. Patricia sent a new laptop within hours, delivered by courier with a security system for his apartment and a note in her handwriting. This has to stop. Stay with me until the hearing. The offer was impossible for a dozen reasons, starting with the fact that James barely knew her and ending with the reality that accepting help from a billionaire felt like charity he'd sworn never to take. He texted back a refusal that was polite but firm. Her response came immediately. Then let me send security to watch your building. The compromise was marginally less insulting. James agreed to security in the lobby, to changing his locks, to letting Patricia's team install cameras outside his apartment. He drew the line at bodyguards, at moving Emily somewhere safer, at any suggestion that he couldn't protect his own daughter. Dorothy had other opinions, delivered over dinner 3 nights before the FDA hearing. You're being stubborn and stupid, and I love you too much to pretend otherwise. I'm being careful. Careful is accepting help when dangerous people are threatening your family. Dorothy pointed her fork at him for emphasis. That woman is trying to keep you safe, and you're treating it like an insult to your manhood. I don't need her protection. Baby, everyone needs help sometimes. Linda knew that. She accepted help from me, from the church, from neighbors when things got hard. Dorothy's expression softened. She'd want you to do the same. This is different. Because Patricia is rich. Or because you're starting to care about her? The question landed like Dorothy's observations always did, surgical in precision, devastating in accuracy. James pushed food around his plate, avoiding her eyes. "I work for her. That's all, if you say so." Dorothy stood clearing dishes. "But for what it's worth, that woman looks at you the same way you look at her when you think nobody's watching." The FDA hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10. James spent Wednesday night reviewing his testimony with Patricia's lawyers, practicing responses to every question Richard Hayes's team might ask. Catherine drilled him mercilessly on his credentials, his methodology, his resignation from St. Michael's. "They're going to try to discredit you personally. When they bring up the NDA, don't elaborate. Just confirm you resigned and moved on. That makes it sound like I was guilty. That's their strategy." Catherine's expression was sympathetic but firm. "The alternative is violating the NDA and giving them ammunition to paint you as someone who can't be trusted with confidential information." The impossible choice was familiar by now. Tell the truth and face legal consequences, or stay silent and let people think the worst. James had been making that choice for 4 years, ever since signing papers that protected a hospital's reputation at the cost of his own. Patricia found him alone in the conference room after the lawyers left, staring at the city lights spread below like a carpet of stars. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him in silence that felt more comfortable than it should have. "You don't have to do this tomorrow. I can present the evidence myself, keep you out of the crossfire. They'll tear apart anything you say because you have a financial interest in the outcome." James kept his eyes on the lights. "I'm the only witness who doesn't work for Donovan Pharmaceuticals. You're also the only one Richard can destroy personally." Patricia's reflection in the glass was ghostly translucent. "If tomorrow goes badly, you lose more than a job. You lose any chance of returning to nursing, any credibility you might rebuild. Your daughter pays the price for my corporate battles. Emily told me something a few weeks ago." James finally turned to face Patricia directly. "She said her mother told her that someday I'd meet someone who makes me want to smile again, that when it happened she should be happy for me." Patricia's expression shifted surprise and something that might have been hope flickering across her features. "James, I'm not good at this, at talking about feelings or pretending I know what I'm doing." James felt heat creep up his neck. "But I need you to know that if tomorrow destroys my life, it's not your fault. I chose this. Because stopping CardioZen matters more than my reputation or career or any of the things I lost 4 years ago. Why? Because 3 people are dead who shouldn't be. Because Linda made me promise not to let grief make me hard. Because doing the right thing when it cost you everything is the only kind of morality that actually means anything." James paused, gathering courage. "And because somewhere in the last 3 weeks I started caring about whether you win this fight." The confession hung between them, impossible to retract. Patricia was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I'm falling for you." The words came quiet but certain. "Which is terrible timing and completely inappropriate given that I'm your employer and we're in the middle of a corporate war. But you deserve to know before tomorrow, before everything potentially falls apart. I don't know how to do this." James gestured helplessly at the space between them. "My wife died 3 years ago. I'm raising a daughter alone in a neighborhood you'd never visit without security. I work for you because you gave me a chance no one else would. The power dynamic is impossible, I know." Patricia stepped closer, close enough that James could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive. "But tomorrow I might lose my company. You might lose your credibility. So maybe tonight we can acknowledge that this thing between us exists, even if we can't act on it." The kiss happened before James could second-guess himself, before fear could overwhelm courage. Patricia's lips were soft, her response immediate and certain. For 10 seconds the world narrowed to the point of contact, to the impossible reality of kissing someone who made him feel like life might contain possibilities beyond survival. James pulled back, his heart hammering. "I need time. Emily needs time. This is too fast, too complicated, I know." Patricia's hand touched his face briefly. "I'm not asking for anything except honesty. Tomorrow we fight Richard Hayes. After that we figure out what comes next. If there is a next." The hearing room was institutional and cold, designed to intimidate with its marble floors and raised panel seating for FDA officials. James sat at a table with Patricia and her legal team facing the panel of medical reviewers who would decide Cardiozen's fate. Dr. Richard Hayes sat on the opposite side with his own lawyers, his expression confident and dismissive. The proceedings began with procedural statements James barely processed. Then the FDA administrator was asking him to state his name and qualifications for the record. James Mitchell, registered nurse specializing in pediatric critical care, currently employed as medical safety consultant for Donovan Pharmaceuticals. The simple statement felt like standing on a ledge waiting to jump. Richard Hayes's lead attorney rose immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it true you surrendered your nursing license 4 years ago following an internal investigation at St. Michael's Hospital?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that investigation concerned the death of a 7-year-old patient under your care?" The courtroom, because that's what this felt like despite being an administrative hearing, went silent. James felt every eye on him, judging, assuming, deciding he was exactly what Richard Hayes needed him to be. The investigation was related to equipment failure. The hospital chose to close the inquiry rather than pursue it further. "So you weren't found guilty of negligence, but you also weren't cleared." Hayes's attorney pressed the advantage. "You simply resigned and signed a non-disclosure agreement." "That's correct. And now 4 years later you're accusing my client of the same kind of negligence you were once accused of. Isn't that convenient?" Patricia's lawyer objected immediately, citing relevance and prejudicial questioning. The FDA administrator sustained the objection, but the damage was done. James watched panel members exchanging glances, doubt written across their faces. The rest of the hearing was brutal. James presented his evidence, the autopsy reports, the drug interaction data, the statistical analysis of adverse events. Angela Brown testified about her husband's death, her voice breaking when she described telling 3 children their father wasn't coming home. Carlos Martinez spoke about Laura about raising their daughter alone. Sarah Johnson presented legal arguments about corporate responsibility and informed consent. Richard Hayes's team countered with expert witnesses who claimed the deaths were coincidental, that drug interactions were theoretical rather than proven, that the families had been manipulated by someone with a vendetta against pharmaceutical companies. They presented James's personnel file from St. Michael's highlighting the patient death and his resignation. They suggested Patricia was manufacturing a crisis to consolidate power, using a disgraced employee to do her dirty work. The administrator called a recess at 3 p.m. Patricia's lawyers huddled immediately, their expressions grim. Catherine spoke in a low voice that James could barely hear. "It's not going well. The panel is skeptical and Hayes's character assassination is working. We presented solid medical evidence." "Medical evidence they're dismissing because our expert witness has credibility issues." Catherine's assessment was brutal. "Unless something changes, they're going to approve Cardiozen." Patricia's expression hardened. "Then we change something." "How?" She stood smoothing her suit. "By doing what I should have done from the beginning." Patricia walked to the center of the room, addressing the administrator directly. "I'd like to make a statement for the record." The administrator looked surprised but gestured for her to proceed. Patricia took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone burning bridges with full awareness of the consequences. "Dr. Richard Hayes has been like family to me since my father's death. I trusted him completely, considered him a mentor and friend. But I cannot let personal loyalty override public safety. The evidence Mr. Mitchell has presented is correct. Cardiozen causes fatal arrhythmias when combined with beta blockers. This interaction was identified during trial design and deliberately ignored because addressing it would require excluding 60% of potential patients. Hayes shot to his feet. "That's a lie. Those are baseless accusations. I have proof." Patricia pulled a thumb drive from her pocket. 3 weeks ago, I installed recording equipment in my office and conference rooms. I have audio of Dr. Hayes admitting he buried the interaction data, that he considered the deaths acceptable losses because the victims were minorities without families likely to sue. She held up the drive. "This recording was made with his knowledge of security systems in my facilities. It's legal and admissible." The room exploded. Hayes's lawyers were shouting about illegal surveillance and entrapment. Patricia's team looked stunned, clearly unaware she'd been recording. The administrator called for order, his gavel striking wood hard enough to echo. "Ms. Donovan, this is highly irregular. Irregular but legal. Recording conversations in my own office where participants are aware security systems exist." Patricia's voice was steel. "The recording proves Dr. Hayes knew about the fatal interactions and chose profit over human lives." The administrator took the thumb drive, disappearing into chambers with other panel members. James sat frozen, watching Patricia field questions from her lawyers about why she hadn't disclosed the recording earlier. Her answer was simple and devastating. "Because I needed to be sure. I needed to give Richard every chance to do the right thing. He chose not to." The panel returned 30 minutes later. The administrator's expression was grave. "After reviewing the recording and all submitted evidence, this panel is denying approval for CardioZen pending additional safety trials. Dr. Hayes, you are being referred to the Department of Justice for investigation into potential fraud and criminal negligence. Ms. Donovan, your petition is granted." Hayes's face went crimson. "This is corporate sabotage. I'll have you removed as CEO before the week is out. You'll have trouble doing that from federal custody." The administrator's voice cut through the bluster. "Officers are already being dispatched to take you into custody for questioning." The hearing dissolved into chaos. James watched federal agents escort Richard Hayes from the room, the man who'd been Patricia's father's best friend, now screaming about betrayal and conspiracies. Patricia stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, and James recognized the look. She'd just sacrificed everything. Her relationship with Hayes, her company's stability, potentially her own position to stop a dangerous drug from reaching market. Outside the building, Patricia's board members were already gathering like sharks sensing blood. Catherine pulled her aside for emergency consultations about the hostile takeover attempt, about whether the recording would be enough to maintain board support. James found himself standing alone on the courthouse steps, watching the sun set over a city that suddenly felt very different than it had that morning. His phone buzzed. "Dorothy, Emily wants to know if you're coming home for dinner. Tell her I'll be there in an hour. Everything okay?" "We won, I think. I'll explain when I get there." The subway ride home was surreal. James sat among people who had no idea their world had just shifted fractionally towards safety, that 3 deaths had been acknowledged, that corporate negligence had faced consequences. An elderly man across from him was reading a newspaper. A young mother was trying to calm a crying infant. Life continued ordinary and precious while James processed what came next. Dorothy met him at the apartment door, Emily visible behind her at the kitchen table with homework spread everywhere. Dorothy's expression was knowing, seeing too much as always. The fancy lady called, said she's taking a leave of absence from her company to deal with the investigation. "Patricia's not fancy. She's just rich. And concerned about you." Dorothy's voice dropped. "She asked if Emily could stay with me for a few days. Said things might get complicated and she wanted to make sure your daughter was safe." The protectiveness shouldn't have surprised James, but it did. Patricia, thinking about Emily's safety when her own world was imploding, spoke to priorities that made his chest tight. "I'll think about it. You'll accept the help." Dorothy's tone brooked no argument. "That woman just blew up her entire life to keep people safe. Least you can do is trust her when she says she's worried about your family." Emily appeared in the doorway, launching herself at James with the unself-conscious joy of 8-year-olds. "I got an A on my science project." "That's my girl." James hugged her tight, breathing in the scent of cheap shampoo and childhood. "Tell me about it." The evening passed in the comforting routine of homework review and dinner preparation, Dorothy's casserole stretching to feed 3 people with leftovers for tomorrow. But underneath the normalcy, James's phone kept buzzing with messages. Patricia's lawyers needed statements. News outlets wanted comments about the hearing. The FDA was requesting follow-up documentation. Around 9, after Emily was asleep, James finally called Patricia. She answered immediately, her voice exhausted. "I've been removed as CEO. Emergency board meeting voted me out an hour ago, citing the recording as evidence I'd violated corporate governance standards." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I made the choice knowing the cost." Patricia's laugh was hollow. Richard's been arrested at least. Federal charges for fraud. My company survives just under new management. What will you do? I don't know. Sell my shares, probably. Start over. Patricia paused, and her next words came quieter. I was thinking about what you said, about needing time, about Emily needing time. I understand if you want distance after today. Emily asked me something a few weeks ago. James watched his reflection in the darkened kitchen window. She asked if I liked you, the way grown-ups like each other. What did you tell her? That I barely knew you? Which was true then. Now I know you're willing to lose everything for the right reasons. That you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. That you kiss like the world is ending and nothing else matters. James felt heat rise up his neck despite being alone. So I guess the answer is yes. I like you the way grown-ups like each other. Patricia's exhale was audible. That's the most terrifying thing anyone's said to me all day. More terrifying than losing your company? Much more terrifying. Because companies can be rebuilt, hearts are harder to fix. The truth of it settled between them across phone lines and city distances. James thought about Linda's 3 promises, about Emily drawing families on oak trees, about Dorothy insisting that love wasn't betrayal. I'm not ready for this. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. Then we go slow. Patricia's voice was gentle. However slow you need. I just sold $1 billion company, James. I've got nothing but time.